Christmas is officially less than a week away, and you know what that means? That's right, that means tax season's a little over a month away. Now, unless you're going to be doing your taxes yourself, that means you're going to be hiring them out for someone to do them for you. And now, regardless if you're going to go to, say, a national chain or your local or regional CPA firms or whatever, or you hire people like me who are self-employed, the reality is that you have to be able to hire someone and trust someone with that type of information. Because if you think about it, that's sensitive information. That's not something that you just give out to anyone. So what can you do to be safe when it comes to this next tax season? Well, here are 10 red flags to keep an eye out for when you're talking to your preparer. Number one is that they are not licensed. Now, before you say, but Trey, you don't have to necessarily have a license in order to prepare taxes. That is true, and because of that, there are going to be unlicensed professionals that know more and are more knowledgeable than say that they're licensed. But I would argue that people who are licensed have more to lose. For example, if I sign off on a fraudulent return or continuously make mistakes, I could lose my license. And if that happens, then I'm going to be blacklisted from accounting professions, which means that all the time that I spent in my career learning and blood and sweat and everything that's poured into it has gone to waste, and I'll have to completely start over. And guess what? It's just not worth it. Now, there are two main players when it comes to the licensed profession. There are certified public accountants or CPAs or enrolled agents or EAs. Now, if your preparer claims to be a CPA, what you can do just to double check is go to cpaverify.org. This is where you can look up their name and everything, and it would actually give you a real life update of what their licenses looks like. So spoiler alert, here's mine, and this is where you can see if they're active or suspended or revoked or whatever. And this will kind of give you, again, a true picture of what their CPA license is from their state board. So obviously you want to see something that has active. That means that they have an active license. So if your preparer claims to be a CPA, but when you look them up, it doesn't show that they're active, ask them about it. And hopefully they'll give you a true answer and then maybe, again, try to back off. Another website you can go to is the IRS Treasury website, where you can actually look at any preparers in your local area or by zip code, and it will tell you if they are a CPA or an EA or other types of criteria. One last place you can check is what's known as the PTIN or PTIN directory. So again, this is PTIN.treasury.gov, and again, you can kind of look up, information that way. Now, I will go ahead and say I don't know how up to date this is, because when I looked myself up, it had me listed in a town that I haven't lived in within 6 years. But regardless, if your preparer claims to be a licensed professional or whatever, use one of these sites and just verify for yourself just to make sure before you move forward. Now, that PTIN website I just mentioned actually flows into the next red flag, and that is that your preparer does not have a PTIN number. Now, a PTIN or PTIN is basically just an identification number when it comes to paid preparers. In order to prepare taxes and sign off on them, you have to have a PTIN. Now, technically, these are very simple to get. There's also jokes that your dead grandmother could get a PTIN. Again, some people call them PTINs, some call them PTINs. But again, it's a necessity to have in order to perform the job. One of the biggest, roadblocks in order to get a PTIN is if you are a registered felon. So one of the things you have to fill out when you renew it or apply for it is that you have to explain or show essentially, if you had a felony on your record. Now, whether this felony will actually prevent you from getting a PTIN, I don't know. I've never tried it. I've never experienced it. I've never heard of a story, but again, I never really asked for stories. But again, in order to perform taxes, you have to have this number, which again, just another little step in order to, properly get through the process. When it comes to that PTIN number, that's going to be a number that's going to show up around that person's signature at the bottom of every return. Now, for 1040s, again, it's on the back page. In every state that I've performed on, there's usually, again, toward the back is usually going to be where your preparer would sign, and their PTIN number would be there. I can't say for certain if every state has them, because again, I haven't performed and returned on, I haven't signed returns on every state, but other ones I have done, yeah, my PTIN number would be there, and again, the one that you hopefully are going to be working with would have one, and that's where they would show up. Speaking of that page, let's talk about the next red flag, and that is no signature. You see, when a preparer actually performs the return, they have to sign off on it if they've received any type of compensation. Now, there's a term out there called ghost preparers, and this happens when you pay somebody, but they do not sign off on it. And one of the biggest reasons, and ways to check it, is if you notice a ghost preparer, usually toward the bottom, instead of seeing its signature, it's going to say self-prepared. This is actually often a joke that we usually say, that if someone gets a tax return from someone else and they get gotten audited or got a letter on it, and they show, hey, here's my return, what did the prior preparer do? One of the first things we check is that signature line, because again, if they actually signed it, then we actually have some connection, and we could probably call up that preparer and say, hey, what happened? Why did you do it this way? But the sad reality is more often than not, if they did something scrupulous and completely messed up, their signature is probably not going to be on it, and it's going to be either blank or it's going to say self-prepared, when in reality, it was not self-prepared. It was a ghost prepared that did not sign off on their own work. The fourth red flag is that is when they charge based on your refund. Now, that is highly unethical, and I want to go as far as saying it is illegal. We as preparers cannot charge based on your refund. So for example, if I have two clients that make the same amount of money, they have the same level of income and sort of same tax situation, but at the end of the day, I spend the same amount of time performing both returns. They have the same schedules. The only difference is client A is going to be getting back so let's say a $100 refund, but client B is going to be getting $7,000 in refunds. I cannot actually charge client B more just because they're getting a higher refund. Again, we cannot do that. Now, the reason for this is because if we are charging based on refunds, then we have an incentive to bump your refunds up. In order to bump your refunds up, we either have to lower your income or try to reach and grab more deductions and credits that you may be eligible for, and that's a recipe for fraud. And again, going back to red flag number 1, we have our licenses to lose if we were doing that. And again, it's not worth. So again, do not go to a preparer that's going to charge you based on your refund, because again, there's going to be an incentive to commit fraud and not give you maybe a more accurate and more, I guess, realistic representation of what your return's supposed to be. Because again, at that point, we have a little bit of incentive to bump it up. And more likely than not, if you know exactly what a tax refund is, you realize it's not free money. You're just getting your money back usually. So any reasonable and respectful tax preparer will actually call you out if you actually do get a big refund. So myself and a lot of other people that I know will actually sit down with you and say, hey, your tax refund is like 10% of your total income. That's a lot of money. So let's start doing this in order to get more money back throughout the year. So this time next year when we do your return, you're not going to get as big of a refund, because that way you'll get the money up front throughout the year rather than having to wait. And that's a good segue into red flag number 5, and that is guaranteeing a refund. Here, at the end of the day, we can't guarantee a thing until we actually know everything that's happened, with financially throughout the year for you. And even still, sometimes that's not enough. What happened the past 2 tax seasons is that the IRS and how COVID and all these other things were playing around, the tax law changed during tax season. So your refund, if I was performing it in, say, February, would have changed if I was performing your tax return in March. So even though, again, you had the exact same information, because again, you're looking for the prior year, depending on when the tax return was performed, your refund could have changed. So again, there's no way we can guarantee anything until, again, everything is said and done. And at that point, you're already at the tail end of the discussion, and I mean, there's really nothing we can do at that point. Also, throwing this other little, mini red flag out. If you meet someone who is trying to guarantee your refund or maximizing or whatever, and they have a list on social media and they use all these icons and emojis and everything, yeah, that's something that we joke about. We usually call it scrapbooking. Usually people who do that obviously probably don't really know what they're talking about, and you really aren't going to see a lot of people use that a lot. So again, if you see a lot of emojis and icons and scrapbooking when it comes to social media posts about you getting your largest refund or guaranteeing a refund, yeah, red flag. The next red flag is that they do not review the tax return with you. You see, whenever we do your tax return, we will want you to make sure that it is correct. Even though you probably know nothing about taxes, we want you to know what your financial situation is when it comes to your incomes and what deductions you qualify for and credits. That way you kind of get an understanding of what's happening in order to better plan, or again, maybe make financial pivots down the road. So again, if you hire a preparer and they just give you, you give them their information, they do it, and they just file it without your consent or without your review, that's a huge red flag. And again, that's very unethical. But again, if you don't know anything that's going on and you just say, well, I'm just going to let them just do it, well, that's also kind of a red flag, because again, what a tax preparer should be able to do is sit down with you, or at least go over it and explain what those numbers mean. Because again, it goes back to incentives and potential for fraud. If I have a client that does not really care what I do with their return, does that give an incentive to someone to, again, underreport income or somehow modify the return to make it more complicated than it needs to be in order to charge more? But at the end of the day, whether you know anything about your taxes or not, you should be able to review it or at least get a sense of what exactly happened on your tax return in your own preparer's words, so you can kind of get a little bit better feeling. And again, when it comes to reviews, you probably are going to have questions. And again, if they can respond to them and keep you up to date on what's going on, again, that's better for you. Red flag number 7 is that they do not ask questions. Now, a good tax preparer is going to bombard you with questions. Now, granted, some of them are going to be conditional. So again, if you're not going to claim, say, any dependents on your taxes, then they probably aren't going to ask you like, hey, how much did you pay a child care provider? Or did this certain kid live with you for over half of the year in your house or whatever? Again, they need to ask questions to get a sense of exactly what has happened throughout that year. And this is true for returning clients. The clients that I have that come year after year, it's the same questions I ask them, even though I know where they live. But again, did I truly know exactly what happened, with their income and all their life events that have happened? No, I don't know, and I don't want to assume either. So again, make sure you get a tax preparer that asks you a lot of questions. Even though a lot of them sound redundant and repetitive and so forth, that's really just to kind of get an idea of exactly what has happened, so we know what questions to ask, what schedules to prepare, and kind of get set up and maybe on deck just in case. But again, if we don't ask those questions, then we don't really know exactly what we're going to be doing. And at that point, then we could be filing and preparing an incomplete return. Next red flag is that they do not use a portal. In today's virtual world, you're probably going to be meeting more and more virtual tax preparers, such as myself. A lot of tax preparers actually started closing up shop after COVID because, again, it just wasn't worth it. Now, there are a lot of tax softwares and tax websites and automation tools that actually make our job a lot easier when it comes to, again, this virtual world. But anything you move to virtual does include more risk, again, which is the whole point of this video. So without a physical brick and mortar storefront to, again, bring your tax returns or your tax documents to, how do you get it to, again, your tax preparer? Well, a portal is probably going to be your best tool, and probably, actually, I'll go as far as saying your only tool. If you meet a preparer that says, hey, just take pictures on your phone and just text them to me, or just send them in an email, or things like that, again, that's a huge red flag, because again, those tax documents have sensitive information on them, and they're not something that you should just take lightly and just throw on an email or send through pictures. Now, we'll go as far as saying that there are a lot of options when it comes to tax portals. There are ones that are actually specifically meant for tax preparers and tax clients. But one that I don't hear anyone using, which again, use a maybe potential red flag, is things like Dropbox or Google Docs. I don't know of any tax professional that actually says, hey, just here's your Dropbox or whatever, just load your documents through there. Usually you'll have to go to a specific portal, again, that is registered through some type of tax software, because again, it has just higher security and higher, again, like IRS regulations when it comes to that data security transfer, which again, if you know anything about data security and how the IRS rules and again, dealing with sensitive information, it's not something to play around with. And again, I don't know of any tax preparer that uses Dropbox or like Google Docs when it comes to transferring those kind of documents. So again, when it comes to your tax preparer and they want your documents just sent to them, make sure to say, hey, where exactly am I loading these? Do I have to sign up for an account? Is there two-factor authentication? How can I specifically get these documents to you in the safest way possible? Because no, I'm not going to just email them or just put them on your Dropbox. Number 9 is that they collect your taxes due, which isn't something that we really hear much about, but again, it is something that you hear about, and well, it does turn around and bite you. So let's say you do your taxes and you come to the very end where it says that you owe additional taxes and rather than getting a refund. Now, what some have actually claimed to do is that your preparer will say, hey, just pay me and we'll send it off. No, that is not really how it works. Your tax preparer should not be a middleman between you and the IRS or state agency or whatever you owe taxes to. We're just giving you the information, and then we'll probably guide you to the website or the portal or whatever in order to pay those fees. We should not be taking any additional money other than, again, our retainers or the fees that we charge, and we're not going to just transfer them over. So you probably guessed by now why this is a red flag, because guess what? If you owed $1,000 on your tax return and I say, hey, just pay me the $1,000, then what's really stopping me from just running away and going to Tahiti? So again, if you ever owe anything through a tax return, whether it's again the federal or a state, just make sure that you actually have the instructions or the know-how to actually pay the agency directly. Don't pay your tax preparer what you owe. Just pay them what they charge for their time or whatever, and that's it. That's all the money that we really should be getting. This last red flag actually stems from what we learned from back in COVID. So going back to the bottom of your tax return where you would hopefully see our signature and PTIN, maybe a bank account information if you're going to be getting a refund. Now granted, you can get refunds either through paper check or direct deposit. Now a lot of people are going to say that a direct deposit is more beneficial or more advantageous, which I do not disagree with. You get it faster and it goes directly to your bank. Whereas a paper check, well, as you know, through everything that's crazy been going on in the world, mail gets delayed, mail gets lost, and you really don't want a refund check just being lost in the mail. So again, direct deposit is usually the way to go. But going back to the red flag about not reviewing, what can happen is if you look at the very bottom where that bank account information is, it may not actually be yours. So you have to make sure that your bank account information is actually where the refund is supposed to go. Now there are things out there that tax preparers can offer called bank products. These are things like advanced like loans against your refunds and other things that honestly I don't really know about because I've never really tried them. I know a lot of other people just completely stay away from them. But what can happen is some people will say, okay, if you are expecting a $2,000 refund, that's what we show on your return. I can give you, say, $1,600 now, again as an advance, or again like just a quicker refund. But the $2,000 that you're actually entitled to is going to be going to my bank. And the sad reality is people actually go through with this. So when it comes down to actually reviewing and again looking at your own tax return, it's actually the preparer's or someone else's bank account information that the refund is going to, not the client's, which again, not a good sign. Because here's what happens. Back when we had all of those stimulus payouts because of COVID, guess what the IRS bases their payments on? Yeah, your eligibility on your refund, but the money goes to the bank account information that was on that specific return. And I think you know where this is going. There have been tax preparers that, again, have been doing this where, again, they've been using their own bank account information in order to, again, just immediately give you a smaller refund up front, and then they just pocket the rest. But guess what? When it came to those stimulus payouts, the tax preparer got all of them. And if you remember back when you actually receive that money and you look at the bank, the bank description or whatever you want to call it, it didn't give hardly any detail. I think it just said irs.treasury.gov, maybe some code, and then the dollar amount. So there was no way to identify what client it was. So again, if you had 100 clients and you did this for all 100 of them, then that tax preparer got 100, payouts, for each of those stimulus payouts, but there was no way to track whose was whose. We don't know if client A's was this amount, if client B's was this amount, or what. It was a huge mess, and there have been news stories about people just lining up outside these tax practices, pretty much demanding their money, because again, the payouts were originally meant for the clients because they're the ones that were eligible for it, because again, their refunds was showing them that they met under a certain income threshold, but the money went to tax preparer, not the client. So people were mad, and obviously for the good reason. So again, if you are expecting a refund, just again to make sure that you are reviewing, which again was a previous red flag, and that it is your bank account information that is on that return. Because again, if the IRS or the government or whoever decides to do additional payouts, again, as the craziness continues, that actually, again, will make sure that it goes to you and not somebody else. So I hope these red flags make your life a little bit easier when it comes to choosing your tax preparer, because again, like I said, at the end of the day, you got to make sure you can trust them, because again, this is not information that should be taken lightly. And again, you just want to stay one step ahead of anyone that could potentially hurt you and commit fraud. And with that, have a happy tax season.